Ever wondered why the Middle Ages seemed so buttoned up? From knights in shining armor to towering cathedrals, we have this image of a very strict, very pious society. And when it comes to people's private lives, especially their sex lives, that image isn't too far from the truth. But why? How did one institution, the church, come to have such a massive say in what happened behind closed doors? Let's dive into how church law came to control nearly every aspect of medieval sex life. To understand this, we need to go back to the early days of Christianity, even before the Middle Ages officially began. Early Christian thinkers, like St. Augustine, were wrestling with big questions about human nature, sin, and salvation. Augustine, who had a pretty wild youth himself, came to see desire as a powerful, disruptive force. He argued that the original sin of Adam and Eve wasn't just about eating an apple. It was about disobedience, and that this sin was passed down through generations. Through the act of procreation itself, this idea was a game changer. It meant that sex, even within marriage, was tainted with sin because it was driven by lust. The only thing that could redeem it was the intention to have children. So, from the get-go, the purpose of sex was strictly defined: procreation. Anything else was seen as giving in to lust for its own sake, which was a big no-no. This theological foundation became the bedrock of all future church law on the subject. As the Roman Empire crumbled and the church stepped into the power vacuum, it began to build a massive legal system known as canon law. This wasn't just about how to run a monastery. It was a comprehensive legal code for all Christians. And since everyone in medieval Europe was considered a Christian, canon law was, in effect, the law of the land for personal matters. One of the Church's primary tools for enforcing these rules was the sacrament of confession. Starting around the 12th century, it became mandatory for all Christians to confess their sins to a priest at least once a year. To help priests navigate these confessions, they were given guidebooks called penitentials. These were essentially detailed catalogs of sins and their corresponding penances. And let me tell you, they got incredibly specific about sex. These manuals asked about everything. What positions were used? Did it happen on a holy day? Was it with your spouse? Was it for pleasure? The questions were designed to root out any sexual act that wasn't purely for procreation. For example, any position other than the so-called missionary position was often condemned because it was thought to be less effective for conception and therefore more about pleasure. The Church saw it as imitating the behavior of animals and an affront to human dignity. The penances could range from a few days of fasting for a minor infraction to years of prayer and pilgrimage for more serious offenses. This system of confession and penance was incredibly powerful. It didn't just punish sin. It shaped people's understanding of what sign asterisk was asterisk. It took the private, intimate act of sex and made it a matter of public, religious concern. People internalized these rules, feeling guilt and shame for desires that we would consider perfectly natural today. Marriage itself was brought firmly under church control. Before the High Middle Ages, marriage was often a private agreement between two families, a contract. But the church declared marriage a sacrament, a holy institution ordained by God. This meant the church got to set the rules. They decided who could and couldn't get married. For instance, they created complex rules about consanguinity, which is a fancy word for how closely related you are. You couldn't marry your third cousin, or even the godparent of your sibling. The web of forbidden relationships was so vast that many nobles found it difficult to find a suitable spouse without getting a special dispensation from the church, which, of course, often came with a hefty fee. This gave the church immense political power, as it could grant or deny marriages that formed powerful alliances between noble families. The church's control extended to the timing of sex, even within marriage. The medieval calendar was filled with days when sexual activity was forbidden. You couldn't have sex during Lent, a period of 40 days. You couldn't during Advent. Not on Sundays, not on Wednesdays or Fridays, and not on the many saints' days and feast days that dotted the calendar. When you had it all up, couples were told to abstain for nearly half the year. The idea was to keep people's minds focused on spiritual matters, not worldly pleasures. Of course, we have to ask, did people actually follow all these rules? The answer is, it's complicated. We know from the very existence of these detailed penitentials that people were, in fact, breaking the rules all the time. Humans are humans after all. But the rules still mattered immensely. They created a culture of guilt and a constant awareness of sin. They gave the church a direct line into the most personal aspects of people's lives. Why was the church so obsessed with this? It was about more than just morality. It was about order. In a chaotic medieval world, the church presented itself as the ultimate source of stability and divine authority. By regulating something as fundamental and powerful as human sexuality, the church demonstrated its power to govern every facet of life, from the king on his throne to the peasant in his hut. It was a way to create a unified Christian society, a Christendom, where everyone lived according to God's law as interpreted by the church. This control also reinforced social hierarchies. The clergy, who were supposed to be celibate, were placed at the top of the spiritual ladder, seen as holier because they had renounced the flesh. Married laity were a step below, and anyone engaging in sex outside of procreative, marital acts was at the very bottom. This structure permeated all of society. So, when we look back at the Middle Ages, it's as clear that the church's control over sex wasn't just a random set of quirky rules. It was a systematic, deeply ingrained legal and cultural framework. It grew from early theological ideas about sin, was enforced through confession and penance, and was cemented by the church's control over the sacrament of marriage. It was a powerful tool for social order, political influence, and shaping the very conscience of medieval men and women. It reminds us that for much of history, the line between the public and the private, the secular and the sacred, was blurry indeed. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into history interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more. See you next time.